Okay, so we're starting with the final act, which is in the morning room at the manor house. Gwendolyn and Cecily are at the window looking out into the garden. Again, there is a much greater sense of female agency and control in this play than in any of the others, really, that we've studied. Birthday Party or Streetcar. Desire Under the Elms is comparable in that respect. Abby has a great deal of power and agency in that particular text, but this is obviously a completely different aesthetic, and this is continued in this opening dialogue. The fact that they did not follow us at once into the house as anyone else would have done seems to me to show that they have some sense of shame left. They've been eating muffins that looks like repentance, and so that they've got this suggestion here that the female characters are sort of in expectation of passivity from the male characters, and that they are interpreting their passivity rather as a sign of their own predominance and their own authority in this scenario where these relationships are being formulated. And I think we see that in complete contrast to Stanley Kowalski. We have this great sense of male agency in Streetcar that grants him all of the power in dictating the formation of relationships, both his own and Blanche's with Mitch. There's a powerful sense of the hypocrisy of their manners in the dialogue that follows. They don't seem to notice us at all. Couldn't you cough? I haven't got a cough. They're looking at us, what effrontery. They're approaching. That's very forward of them. So there's an enormous sense of hypocrisy here where they're being criticised in the opening kind of gambit for being passive and not following them. And then now they're being criticised for being forward by approaching them. So there's a no-win situation here for them. And I think that hypocrisy over manners and the codes of behaviour that govern the way that people are supposed to, engage with each other, particularly in incipient relationships, is directly comparable to Blanche, who's constantly clinging on to that idea of chivalry, but then in her own behaviour enacts the complete reverse of that sort of dignified, moralistic understanding of basically flirtation and the beginning of relationships. So there's a real sense of I think, consistency between the two plays here about the hypocrisy involved in social manners. At the bottom of the page is this suggestion of aestheticized reality and control. In this play, because it's written by an aesthete for a very self-consciously sort of aesthetic, artistic agenda, having aesthetic control over reality is a sign of power in this play. And it's also actually a sort of fortunate serendipitous coincidence of material wealth and aesthetic sensibility, which is obviously something that Blanche is missing at the time. She almost can't afford to see reality in the way that she likes to, because she doesn't have the material power to justify her lifestyle and her beliefs. And this is what Gwendolyn says: this dignified silence seems to produce an unpleasant effect, a most distasteful one, but we will not be the first to speak, certainly not. They are commenting on the aesthetic nature of reality here and governing its unfolding through the lens of style. Life is attempting to mirror the style of art, and they are the ones that have the reins over this. The extent to which life begins to mirror art, and it's most definitely the kind of reverse of Blanche's situation, who is attempting to gain aesthetic control over life and failing to do so as a passive, victimized female figure. These two are in a completely reversed position here in terms of power and their ability to wield control over reality using aesthetic vision. Now, Gwendolyn says, Cecily says to Gwendolyn, that certainly seems a satisfactory explanation, does it not? We're talking here about why Algernon has pretended to be Jack's brother. And he just says, in order that I might have an opportunity of meeting you. And then Gwendolyn says, yes, it's a satisfactory explanation if you can believe him. I don't, but does that not affect the wonderful beauty of his answer? True, in matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing. And this is precisely the type of vision that we want, that Blanche wants, reality how it should be, that she says in her famous kind of lines towards Mitch, I think it is, in the later acts of the play, the later scenes of the play, that she wants reality to be a certain way, and it isn't. And that's precisely what these two characters are able to do. And Algernon is part of the formation of that sort of stylistic vision of reality, because he views the world in that fashion as well. He believes in style as a sort of a bulwark, a barrier, a buffer between the brutality of natural realism and how human vision ought to be. And then a little further down, Gwendolen actually sort of chooses her own interpretation and explanation in what she agrees to, which convinces herself in the end, based on the style of Algernon's voice alone. So she says, I have great doubts upon the subject, but I intend to crush them. This is not the moment for German scepticism. Sorry, she's talking to Jack here, obviously. Their explanations appear to be quite satisfactory, especially Mr. Worthing's. That seems to me to have the stamp of truth upon it. I am more than content with what Mr. Moncrieff said. His voice alone inspires one with absolute credulity. And so here, they provide their own explanations and their own justification for believing what they're saying, because it allows them to give themselves sort of moral approbation for their own attraction. And so again, it's the style and the quality of their explanations, the way that they are living and speaking as if life itself were an artwork, that in the end convinces them that what they're saying is true. And so again, that stylistic vision of reality is much the same as Blanche's attempt to mask the cold light of reality with the paper lantern. We've got people here that are forcefully attempting to understand life through the lens of aestheticism, but are able to do so, I would say, from a kind of Marxist perspective, because they are in a commanding economic position, because they are not battling against the kind of the changing tides of history in the same way that Blanche is. Over the page, they talk about the Christian names. And they're speaking together, Gwendolen and Cecily, shows us that their identity is basically forcefully transformed by the dominance of the aesthetic vision of reality of the women who have that vision and who believe in it, which is again the reverse of Blanche's fate. Gwendolen and Cecily says, your Christian names are still an insuperable barrier, that is all. And then Jack and Algernon speak together. Our Christian names, is that all? But we were going to be christened this afternoon. So here we've got this ritual, again, like it's a ritual about the affirmation of identity, in the same way that a birthday party is an affirmation of identity. And Blanche undergoes has the birthday party experience hollowed out of its significance. But again, these rituals that are about the affirmation of identity are again hollowed out and made insignificant by the way that these female characters are able to sort of whimsically enforce the male characters, to make their identities malleable, to bend who they are purely because it suits their stylistic inclinations, So they are again in that sort of reverse position of Blanche, who is constantly attempting to, see Mitch, for example, through the lens of chivalry, where she calls, oh, my Rosen Cavalier. He absolutely doesn't fulfill the criteria that Blanche is expecting when she thinks about reality and relationships in those terms. But the men here are forcefully required to alter the entire nature of who they are, or the most symbolic feature of who they are, the names, in order to fulfill that idealized aesthetic vision that the female characters in the play are so fond of. Further down, there's this one of Wilde's kind of famous paradoxical epigram, and I think the quality of this epigram actually reverses the power dynamics of gender that we are continually kind of familiar with in the history of literature, particularly at this moment in time. The Victorian age is one famous for its kind of patriarchal norms and structures. But here, Gwendolen says, how absurd to talk of the equality of the sexes, where questions of self-sacrifice are concerned. Men are infinitely beyond us. We are, clasps hands with Algernon. They have moments of physical courage of which we women absolutely know nothing. And so we've got here, this backhanded compliment that somehow men are much more sacrificing and giving. But of course, what it's really drawing attention to um, in her belief system is that the men are the malleable ones, the ones who have to change and be adjustable to the whims and inclinations of others. And again, we see, I think, elements of that in Stanley Webber, particularly through the drum symbol, who I think shows through that symbol the malleable nature of himself and how it is co-opted into the needs of others. Wilde makes use of an important kind of dramatic entrance further down, which disrupts its Lady Bracknell, and she, is an antagonistic force towards the sort of social harmony that these relationships are attempting to create through their togetherness, because she represents the kind of the hostility of class prejudice and of social superiority that is a danger to this social cohesion that these relationships are likely to create. And she comes in, and the couples separate in alarm. So we see that suggestion there of her entrance being kind of representative of a threat to this cohesive, stylistic social fabric that will be embodied in the relationships. We think of her entrance like Goldberg and McCann's and their disruption of Stanley's sort of catatonic norm that he has created in the boarding house. And also Stanley's entrance in Mitch and Blanche's relationships, his physical invasion of space in the streetcar is disruptive of a temporary sense of social cohesion and social harmony. Lady Bracknell then manifests her dominance through physicality at the bottom of the page. In the bottom of the page, like Goldberg and McCann and Stanley Kowalski, Goldberg and McCann's insistence around the motif of sitting is one of the biggest kind of representative moments in the play of the abstract sort of hierarchical nature of relationships in a physical set piece of theatre. She says, "Come here, sit down immediately. Hesitation of any kind is a sign of mental decay in the young, of physical weakness in the old." And so that those imperatives in her language around the issue of sitting down, again, show us that her expectation is to be adhered to, and subordination is what she is expecting. Her language is full of hypocrisy around social norms and manners. And she's talking here about Mr. Bracknell. Her unhappy father is, I'm glad to say, under the impression that she is attending a more than usually lengthy lecture by the University Extension Scheme on the influence of a permanent income on thought, which is a great piece of irony by Wilde, showing us the dangers of that permanent income on her thinking and her crass kind of prejudices. And she says, "Indeed, I've never undeceived him on any question. I would consider it wrong." So she's, backwardsly associating deception with morality, and that there is a positive morality associated with deception. I think, again, that invites comparison with Blanche, who sees a sense of moral conviction in the fabrications that she is constantly constructing throughout the play. Further down, Wilde exposes her callousness, Lady Bracknell's blindness to Algernon's deception, which is caused by her class prejudice, which I think invites comparison with Stanley's Kowalski's sort of limited understanding of reality in Streetcar. He says, "Dead. When did Mr. Bunbury die? His death must have been extremely sudden. Oh, I killed Bunbury this afternoon. I mean, poor Bunbury died this afternoon. What did he die of? Bunbury? Oh, he was quite exploded. Exploded? Was he the victim of a revolutionary outrage? I was not aware that Mr. Bunbury was interested in social legislation. If so, he is well punished for his morbidity. He gets his comeuppance for supposedly, in her fictional world, being interested in social legislation, being a kind of social radical." And so we have this moment where Algernon completely clumsily sort of reveals the nature of his deception, and she can't identify even when it's explicitly communicated to her, because of her desire to be hostile towards people from inferior positions in the social hierarchy towards her. So that limitation of her vision and her perception is based on her materialistic understanding of class and class positions, which is a lot like Stanley Kowalski's, obviously from a different position in the socio-economic hierarchy. My dear Aunt Augusta, I mean, he was found out. The doctors found out that Bunbury could not live. That is what I mean. So Bunbury died. And so here, there's this kind of play on words of found out, of discovery and revelation, being kin almost to death. And so deception itself in Algernon's language allows for a kind of vital play of life and relationships and love. Like Blanche's lamp, that deception enables a type of vitality, but of course in Streetcar it's choked off for Blanche, it's prevented. We see a great deal of that false gentility. That lady is Miss Cecily Cardew, my ward. Lady Bracknell bows coldly to Cecily. So we have that false gentility where language is suspect and not frank and honest in its communication. We actually see the truth through the actions of people throughout the play. And we see more of this between Cecily and Gwendolen. Further down, Lady Bracknell exposes her hostility to Jack because of his compromise, we'll call it, class position. He's not associated with a great family line and an enormous sort of fortune based on family. And she says, I think some preliminary inquiry on my part would not be out of place. Mr. Worthing, is Miss Cardew at all connected with any of the larger railway stations in London? I merely desire information. Until yesterday, I had no idea that there were any families or persons whose origin was a terminus. Jack looks perfectly furious, but restrained himself. So we can see this class prejudice that she is enacting against him and his contained rage at that class prejudice. But here, the difference is that class prejudice that she fails to understand is that in the end, Jack is destined to be wealthy and powerful in the same terms, and on the same terms as other wealthy and powerful people in the play. He ends up being connected to a wealthy man with an attachment to aristocratic fortune. So although we have that sense of destined power like Stanley Kowalski, it's actually not because of a change in social circumstances and social structure. It's actually because he ends up bending to social orthodoxy in a way that, say, Stanley Kowalski is responsible for adapting and changing, and Stanley Weber is forcefully and aggressively converted back into. Lady Bracknell then says, that sounds not unsatisfactory. Miss Cardew is the granddaughter of the late Miss Thomas Cardew of 149 Belgrave Square, southwest London, Gervase Park, Dorking, Surrey, and the Sporran, Fifeshire. So that sounds unsatisfactory. 3 addresses always inspire confidence, even in tradesmen. But what proof have I of their authenticity? We've got this reflection, I think, on the false signs of legitimacy and orthodoxy in just simply the reciting of addresses that obviously imply that someone has a kind of country estate and a holiday home up in Scotland and an address in a rich part of London, in a rich part of the south of England. So we've got this language that is really all it is. It's performance, and it's much like Goldberg's language that invokes family and legitimacy and morality and ethnic identity as sources of belonging here, but they are false signs of identity, belonging, and identity construction.